When looking back at the Metal Gear franchise, you pretty much always hear about the Solid games, Metal Gear Solid itself. And to this day, I still encounter people who forget that there were actually Metal Gear games before that advancement in the franchise. Now, we would go on to get, side stories, things that are off in their own canon like Acid, Metal Gear Acid, things like Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, but in general, Metal Gear is known mostly for the Solid games, which were pioneered largely by Hideo Kojima. That said, he did work on games prior to the Solid games, even in the Metal Gear franchise, like Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Previously, I covered Metal Gear 1 and talked about whether or not I thought it held up, and for a little context, I am a big fan of retro games. They don't age terribly for me in a lot of cases. I'm not someone who thinks new thing good, old thing bad. But in general, I was very impressed by what Metal Gear 1 did at the time and how well it held up just as an arcadey type of stealth action game. That said, looking at Metal Gear 2, a game that is arguably made better in most ways, I think I might have some controversial opinions on this one. So, let's take a look at the history of Metal Gear 2 briefly, and then talk about the game. If you enjoy this video, you want to leave a like, subscribe, I appreciate that very much. Videos like this that are more analytical projects are made largely possible by my channel members and patrons. They normally don't do nearly as well as talking about something in the news, because that's just how YouTube is. It pushes the latest and greatest thing. Retro gaming is not that. So if you want to support this channel and make sure more videos like that are made, the ways to join our channel memberships are down below this video with the join button. You get access to exclusive channel videos, and also as well, we do have several other channels and we have a Patreon as well. So thank you very much for supporting that. Now, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake has a very interesting history, considering it's a game that series creator Hideo Kojima actually never planned to make. Now, ironically, this statement can be said about several entries in the Metal Gear Solid franchise as well, since this game would kick off a series of will they, won't they statements from Kojima, who later wanted to move on from Metal Gear Solid and pass that franchise off to some kind of successor. But in general, Metal Gear 2 owes its success to a game that didn't even come from Kojima, which was the port of Metal Gear on the NES. Now, the port of Metal Gear on the NES is a weird game. It doesn't really stay true to what Metal Gear was on the MSX in many ways due to system limitations. But that said, Hideo Kojima was actually brought in to help create a game for the MSX console, which wasn't really big in the West. And you might see where this is going, because the NES was big in the West. Now, the MSX did exist in Western countries like Europe, America, things like that, but it was extremely niche technology, and it didn't get nearly the widespread release that it saw in Eastern markets and Asia in general. Meanwhile, Nintendo had essentially reworked their Famicom console as the Nintendo Entertainment System for Western markets, and that platform went on to be a huge success. Now, because of this, Metal Gear 1 was also created for the NES, even though the game was significantly different from Kojima's version of the MSX stealth title. Now, this game was so successful on the NES, despite not being worked on by Kojima, who pioneered large portions of the stealth genre through his MSX title Metal Gear, this game went on to be a very, very big hit on the NES. It's actually the version of Metal Gear that many grew up with in the West, even if it isn't series creator Hideo Kojima's version of the game. It was actually so successful on the NES and in the West that Konami wanted a sequel specifically for the NES, not the MSX from the original creator, and that's why Snake's Revenge was born, which was almost like a Metal Gear 2 before Metal Gear 2. Now, Hideo Kojima crossed paths with a member of the Snake's Revenge dev team while taking a train ride in Tokyo, and the developer suggested that he would love to see Kojima create what he called a true sequel to the original Metal Gear game, and not just see a sequel that was mandated by Konami for the NES, considering Kojima, the architect in many ways of that original game, didn't make the NES port and didn't make Snake's Revenge. It was completely divorced from him. Kojima recounted this story a couple of times, such as in the 1990 issue of MSX magazine, where he said that this gave him the push he needed to develop a storyline and approach Konami for the green light to create a sequel to the MSX version of Metal Gear 1, which Konami did approve. I also remember him making a statement about how he even had a rough outline in his head of where he wanted the story to go by the time the train had gotten to his stop. Now that said, this, like I said, is a game that almost didn't exist, might not have ever existed if not for the weird situation around the NES version of the original game, might not have ever existed if not for the weird mandated NES-only sequel to the NES-only version of the game, and if there hadn't been this chance encounter on the train. This is very much a butterfly effect game, and in that way, Metal Gear 2 is also responsible for the existence of pretty much everything after it. Even if you don't care about Metal Gear 1 and 2 at all, you owe the existence of any Solid games you might enjoy to the existence of these games, and that's why they're still incredibly important in their place in gaming history. Now, when we actually took a look at Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, which I played through entirely over on my Let's Play channel Degenerate Plays, along with Metal Gear 1, so the link to that is going to be in the description down below. I'll actually even include the link to the playlist for it. We played through both of these games, and when we did that, we had some interesting experiences with them, my wife Jill and I. We found that this game, Metal Gear 2, does go a lot deeper than Metal Gear 1 with a more detailed world and hidden items. The first game does have hidden items, and it does have a fascinating world, but in general, the depth isn't fully there yet. There's no going prone, there's not really great sneaking other than just avoiding people in general, there's a lot of ways to cheese the game. It's an awesome, fun, arcade, classic type of, stealth game, and in fact, in many ways, it had elements of an open world game even in it for the time that were truly mind-boggling. But it wasn't that advanced compared to later games. And of course it wasn't, it was the first. But Metal Gear 2 does move beyond that in many different ways. It actually begins to give Solid Snake a real characterization and story. He's not really anymore just Thomas Military Man. He's basically an actual character, and he does have thoughts and feelings and development. Now, with all of that said, is it on the level of Metal Gear Solid 1's story? No, it's not. It doesn't have voice acting, not that you always need that. It doesn't have as in-depth of character development. The character roster is not as big, but it is laying the groundwork for that Solid series and does actually expand all of these characters very significantly. One of the characters that lays the most groundwork for in the series, other than just Solid Snake, is Gray Fox, and the idea of the cybernetic ninja, which would appear throughout the series in general, that archetype. I think people jumping into MGS1 without Metal Gear 2, at the very least, are not going to get the full impact of Snake and Fox's relationship before Metal Gear Solid 1. I don't think reading a summary of previous operations really does it justice to actually see that. Now, does that justify playing the whole game for you? Maybe not. I'm not sure, depending on who you are and the time you have. But I do think it does add depth to Metal Gear Solid 1's story and history in that way, including in the connections to Big Boss. Now, that said, the mechanics are able to go more deeply than the previous game as well, and are very impressive. Things like going prone, being able to lie down and go underneath hideable obstacles, or obstacles that you can hide in, I should say. That was something we didn't really see in Metal Gear 1. That was something very, very impressive. And by going more in depth with these mechanics, something like going prone, something we don't even see in every game today, right? There are still games that don't have that kind of feature that could benefit from it. Think of Assassin's Creed. They didn't add that in until very recently with their stealth, but they were a stealth franchise. This was doing it back in the, 80s. That's impressive. But even with going more in depth with these mechanics, it does become a bit of a catch-22. Enemies had to be made more advanced. But at the same time, I found that the game wasn't advanced enough at this time, they were still learning these things, to deal with different elements like how to avoid enemies when leaving rooms, where maybe you could be instantly spotted when switching screens. And there are ways to deal with this, like the scope, but it does become kind of meticulous and a chore to know that you might leave a room with no problems. Maybe you don't want to, take the time to pull out this scope. You want to actually play it like a Metal Gear Solid game, and you just want to move room to room, and you might get unlucky at one point, or you might just get lucky at another point, because it's just not quite there yet. Now, that said, I am impressed by those mechanics. They are very, very cool, and it's something where you can recognize the milestones in gaming from this without necessarily it being your favorite Metal Gear game, or without necessarily loving it. I found myself not loving Metal Gear 2, but still able to be impressed by its positive qualities. In terms of qualities, though, and characterization, while Solid Snake was an improvement, I am very surprised, as someone who had played Solid games first, going back to this, to see the characterization of Big Boss. Big Boss in Metal Gear 2 is a pretty generic character. Now, while there are some elements that could be seen as good from him, like taking in orphans of war, Big Boss comes off less like he cares about his soldiers, and more like he just cares about fueling the military-industrial complex of war. Now, would that be a problem if that was just his character? No. Somebody could argue it's boring, sure, but if it was just true to his character and this is who he was in general, I would say, well, maybe I don't prefer this character, or maybe I don't think this is well written. I wouldn't say this doesn't seem consistent. But the problem is that when you get down to it with the other games and how they characterize Big Boss over the years, this makes this characterization come off inconsistent to me. In later games, Naked Snake, who would go on to become Big Boss, is characterized in a much deeper way, where he may be misguided with some of his opinions on war and its perpetuation, but he does care for his soldiers. He genuinely does believe in his cause. In Metal Gear 2, he's basically just a generic villain who likes war. I don't think those are the same thing. I mean, very obviously this is because these characters would go on to become more detailed, but in terms of a timeline where it takes place after many of those games, it kind of stands out as a sore thumb. I think this is a game that I can recognize is very good and very impressive in so many ways, but I just didn't enjoy it as much as Metal Gear 1. Being able to go through and find some of these hidden items and have items transform, even weird mechanics like a snake eating through your rations and ruining your items, things like that, they're very innovative and fascinating. But playing Metal Gear 1 and 2, especially 2, made me actually wish at some point that we could get a more in-depth look at this era of Solid Snake's life and at Big Boss's later life, with a more detailed story that actually captures the nebulous nature of who Big Boss was. Big Boss is not a character that can be broken down as a hero, and he's not a character that can be broken down as a villain. And in fact, that's why I think, one of many reasons why I believe, that Kojima and the other co-directors and writers who worked on the Metal Gear franchise succeeded, was they wrote complex human characters who weren't just the good guy or just the bad guy. There were good and bad things about them. I know that remakes are a touchy subject, especially when it comes to this series and when it comes to Konami, but the potential for a storyline leading into MGS1 is right there. It's right out in the open, but these two games take up that time period. Even though most of gaming wasn't at the level of storytelling of Metal Gear Solid 1 at the time these games came out, or even at the time Metal Gear Solid 1 came out, I still think about that playing through these games. And playing this game also reminded me of how much was added on over time in the series. Venom Snake's journey, for example. It doesn't really fit with Metal Gear 1 or 2 unless you're just headcanoning it as an explanation, which I don't want to get into heavy spoilers involving Big Boss, Venom Snake, all this stuff, but the reason is because it wasn't thought of yet. You can explain it away. You can explain away Big Boss's characterization, Venom, all these different eras of his life, but Big Boss's characterization was more of a stereotypical cartoon villain here, rather than his complex motivations that are reflected in later games, along with the ties to Venom, that era, etc. But in general, it made me wish that there was another Solid game after MGS5 that tied directly to Metal Gear 1, and that there would be some kind of in-depth remake of Metal Gear 1 and 2 on the same level of story as Solid 1 and on. Now, that's not to say Metal Gear 2 doesn't hold up. It's impressive. It laid so much groundwork for this series and for gaming and the stealth genre. But when looking at just how impressive later titles are, and the depth of their stories in particular, playing this game does make me wish that those first 2 arcs of Metal Gear could have had that same level of story, or maybe could have it now. Who knows, maybe in the future this is something that could happen. I'm not sure if people would be very resistant to it, or if it could even capture the magic of what the Solid games were. I'm not sure. And I'm not even sure who you'd have write that. There were other writers, there were other directors on Metal Gear who did do a good job, but Kojima is that looming presence in the background of Metal Gear that, because he was tied to it since MG1, makes it difficult to move past him. I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of these games, particularly Metal Gear 1 and 2? I have a previous video covering Metal Gear 1 and how I think it holds up on this channel. If you're interested in this more kind of analytical or review type content, I do the same thing with movie reviews. I have a playlist of video game reviews and other stuff like that here, and I have a playlist of Metal Gear videos on this channel, as well as having Metal Gear playlists and playthroughs over on my channel Degenerate Plays, where we play through games podcast style. We have played through Metal Gear Solid 1, Metal Gear 1, Metal Gear 2, we're in the process of finishing the Twin Snakes right now, and then we're moving on soon to Metal Gear Solid 2. So lots of games are over there if you're interested, always trying to grow that. We do have a Fortnite code which goes to help support our channel, DJAY123, and that same code can be used on our store, CosmoBunny.shop, where we sell coasters, keychains, trays, and more from recycled paper, from comics, manga, magazines, and more books that have been damaged. What we do is we take these damaged books, save some of the paper that can be saved, keep it out of landfills, make something new for your home, transformatively in a new medium, reusing that paper, not printing out images, and then we recycle the rest. I hope you have a fantastic day, and as always everyone, stay shui.